A shift like no other. The factory hummed with the steady rhythm of heavy machinery, its symphony of steel clanking and gears grinding filling the massive industrial space. Ethan Cole stepped onto the factory floor, the scent of oil, metal, and grease as familiar to him as the pulse in his veins. At 47, Ethan was a seasoned factory worker, his years of labor etching calluses into his hands and lines into his face. But before he worked with steel, he had been a Marine, a man trained for battle, discipline, and resilience. He had seen the world at its darkest, had fought in places most wouldn't dare think about, and had returned home with both pride and ghosts trailing behind him. Now his battles were simpler: meeting quotas, fixing faulty machines, and making sure he didn't lose his fingers in the process. Yet that particular evening, something far more sinister was about to unfold. Ethan pushed open the metal doors leading into the factory, clocking in as he had for the last 8 years. The glow of the fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the factory floor. Workers moved with the efficiency of routine, their movements practiced and precise. The smell of burnt metal lingered in the air, a scent Ethan had long since stopped noticing. He made his way to his workstation, passing the hydraulic press he would be working with for the next 8 hours. It was a behemoth of a machine, capable of molding sheets of metal into precise components used in construction and heavy machinery. Dangerous if you didn't respect it. Ethan had seen men lose fingers, once, even an arm, to the unforgiving jaws of the press. He set his lunchbox down, adjusted his safety helmet, and stretched his arms. Another long shift. Another night of back-breaking labor. He glanced toward his boss's office, debating whether to finally bring up his request for time off. His younger sister, Sarah, had been going through a rough patch, and he had promised to visit her in Colorado to help with the kids. But his boss, Mr. Garrett, was not a man known for generosity. As if on cue, Ethan spotted Garrett through the small window of the office door. The older man was engaged in an intense conversation with 2 men Ethan didn't recognize. They stood out, too sharply dressed for this industrial environment. Black suits, stiff postures, faces unreadable. Ethan frowned. Something about them set off alarm bells in his head. He paused, debating whether to knock and interrupt, but the look in his boss's eyes, tight, cautious, and bordering on nervous, told him this was no ordinary meeting. His military instincts whispered a warning. Whatever was going on in there, it was best not to be seen listening. With a shake of his head, Ethan turned and headed back toward his machine. He had just reached his workstation when something unusual caught his eye. A flash of blue beneath the machinery. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he was sure he had seen something move. A shadow, a flicker of color. His stomach tightened. The factory was no place for stray animals, too many hazards. And it sure as hell wasn't a place for people to be lurking in the shadows. Frowning, Ethan took a step closer, scanning the dim space beneath the machine. It was dark, littered with metal shavings and dust, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A small figure curled up tightly in the shadows. His breath caught. It was a child. A little girl. She was trembling, arms wrapped around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her long, dark hair was tangled, her oversized blue sweater covered in dust. She looked terrified. Ethan crouched down, keeping his voice low and calm. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, careful not to startle her. "What are you doing down here? This place isn't safe." The girl didn't move, didn't speak. Only her wide, fearful eyes peered up at him. Ethan's concern deepened. How had she even gotten in here? The factory was locked up tight after hours. There were security cameras, guards at the front entrance. A child getting past all that. Nearly impossible. "Can you come out?" he asked gently. Still, she didn't move. But when Ethan reached out his hand, ready to help, her sleeve shifted slightly. And that's when he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. There, on her small wrist, was a tattoo, A barcode. The ink was dark against her pale skin, precise and cleanly etched. His blood turned to ice. Ethan had seen that kind of marking before, not on children, but on crates, cargo, property. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just a lost child. This girl was running from something terrible. And if he didn't act fast, she might not survive the night. The unseen truth. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes locked onto the barcode tattoo on the little girl's wrist. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. A barcode. Something usually reserved for merchandise, inventory, or shipments, was permanently inked onto the fragile skin of a child. The implication sent a chill through his veins, darker than anything he had encountered in his years as a Marine. He knew exactly what this meant. Human trafficking. He had seen it before in war zones, had raided compounds where men, women, and even children had been held like property, stripped of their humanity, and reduced to numbers on a ledger. The memory made his stomach twist with rage. And now, standing in the middle of a steel factory in America, he was staring at evidence that the same evil was happening right under his nose. The girl, still crouched under the machine, met his gaze, her wide, frightened eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he was friend or foe. She didn't speak, but Ethan could see the way she trembled, her small hands clutching the hem of her sweater, her body pressed tightly against the cold steel as if trying to disappear. Ethan swallowed hard and had forced himself to breathe. He had to be careful. If she had been hiding, then she was running from something or someone. If he scared her, she might bolt again, and that could be disastrous in an environment as dangerous as this. The factory was filled with moving machinery, hydraulic presses, conveyor belts, and cutting equipment. One wrong move, and she could get hurt or worse. He took a slow step back, crouching lower to make himself seem less intimidating. "It's okay," he said, keeping his voice calm, steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Ethan. Can you tell me yours?" The girl hesitated, her lips pressing together. Then, in a voice so small he almost didn't hear it over the roar of the factory, she whispered, "Anna." Ethan nodded. "Anna. That's a beautiful name," he said gently. "Listen, Anna, I know you're scared, but we can't stay here. This machine is dangerous. And if it turns on—" He stopped himself from finishing that sentence. He didn't want to frighten her more. "We need to get somewhere safer. Do you trust me?" Anna hesitated, glancing behind her as if expecting someone to appear and drag her back into the darkness. Ethan followed her gaze, scanning the factory floor, but no one else seemed to be paying attention. Most of the workers were too focused on their own jobs, and those who weren't were locked in conversation or taking their short breaks. No one had noticed the girl, or if they had, they weren't acknowledging her. She turned back to him and gave the smallest nod. Relief flooded through Ethan. "Okay, good. Stay close to me," he instructed, extending his hand. She didn't take it, but she crawled out from under the machine, her small form barely making a sound. Ethan placed himself in front of her protectively, scanning the factory floor once more before leading her toward a less crowded area near the storage units. Every step he took was filled with a rising sense of urgency. This was wrong. All of it. A child with a barcode tattoo. The mysterious men in suits talking to his boss. The way Anna had been hiding, terrified to even breathe too loudly. He had to find out what was going on. But first, he had to make sure she was safe. As they approached the storage area, Ethan glanced down at Anna again. Her sweater was too big for her, the sleeves nearly covering her hands completely. Her jeans were worn, the fabric faded and dirty. Her shoes, cheap canvas slip-ons, were scuffed, the soles worn thin. She wasn't dressed like someone who had simply wandered in off the street. She had been somewhere before this, held captive, transported. The thoughts made his stomach churn. "Anna," he said carefully, keeping his voice low. "Are you lost? Do you have family here?" He watched her face closely, searching for any flicker of recognition or hope at the mention of family. But instead, she stiffened, shaking her head so quickly it was almost frantic. Ethan felt another rush of anger, not at her, but at whatever had been done to her. "Okay," he said, keeping his tone soothing. "You're safe with me. I promise. But I need to know, are you hiding from someone?" Anna's tiny fingers clenched into fists. She nodded once. His jaw tightened. "Is it those men in suits?" This time, she didn't just nod. She shrank, as if the mere thought of them was enough to send her into panic. That was all the confirmation Ethan needed. His mind worked quickly. He couldn't just walk her out of the factory. Security would stop them, ask questions. And if his boss really was involved in whatever this was, there was no telling who else was part of it. He needed to be smart. "Okay," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I need to get you out of here. But first, I need to figure out who else knows about this." He thought about taking her to the security office, but that idea was quickly discarded. If Garrett was involved, he might have already compromised the guards. He couldn't risk it. Instead, he needed a plan, a way to get her out without drawing attention. But before he could think of a solution, the factory intercom crackled to life. "All workers, please return to your designated stations. Unauthorized personnel found on the factory floor will be reported to management." The voice was calm, professional, but something about it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Unauthorized personnel. Was that a coincidence, or had someone seen them? Ethan's gut told him they had just run out of time. "Anna," he whispered urgently, crouching down to her level. "We need to move. Fast." Without waiting for a response, he reached for her hand again. This time, she let him take it. He didn't know who was hunting for her. He didn't know how deep this went. But one thing was clear. This was more than just an accident. This was a cover-up. And if Ethan didn't act fast, Anna might not survive the night. He had spent his whole life following orders, obeying commands, and playing by the rules. But this time, the rules were broken. And Ethan Cole wasn't about to let them win. A desperate escape. Ethan's mind was a battlefield of thoughts as he gripped Anna's small hand and guided her swiftly through the factory's maze of machinery and steel. His instincts, sharpened by years of military service, screamed that they were running out of time. The factory intercom's announcement had been too precise, too perfectly timed. Someone knew about Anna, and they were looking for her. The rhythmic clang of the hydraulic presses and the sharp hiss of welding torches filled the air, drowning out most other noises. Workers remained absorbed in their tasks, oblivious to the silent war Ethan was fighting in his mind. He glanced down at Anna. She was struggling to keep up, her legs moving as fast as they could under the oversized sweater. She wasn't just scared, she was exhausted. How long had she been running? How long had she been hiding? His gut churned with fury, but he shoved his emotions down. There would be time for that later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her out of here. He took a sharp turn and led her toward the storage section of the factory, an area filled with towering metal racks stacked with spare machine parts, steel sheets, and tools. It was quieter here, away from the main production line. The lights were dimmer, flickering slightly from years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it was the best temporary cover he could find. Ethan knelt beside her, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Okay, Anna, listen to me. We're going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say. No running off. No making noise. Got it?" She nodded quickly, her wide eyes still full of fear. "Good. Stay low and stay close to me." Ethan peeked around the storage shelves, scanning the factory floor. Everything seemed normal, too normal. It felt staged, as if someone wanted him to think nothing was wrong. But then he saw them. 2 men in suits. They were moving methodically, scanning the factory with cold, practiced precision. They weren't panicked. They weren't confused. They knew she was here, and they were closing in. Ethan ducked back behind the shelves, his heart pounding. This wasn't just some lost child situation. These men were professionals, traffickers. His fists clenched. He had seen this kind of evil before, in far-off countries, in places where law and order had crumbled. But this was America. This was supposed to be safe. And yet, here was Anna, terrified and alone, marked like property. The thought made his blood boil. He took a steadying breath. Getting emotional wouldn't help. He needed to think clearly. "Anna," he whispered, "we need to find another way out. The front entrance is too risky. Do you know any other exits?" She hesitated, then shook her head. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, thinking. There were 3 main ways out of the factory: the front entrance, the loading docks, and the emergency exits. The front was a no-go, too much security. The emergency exits would trigger an alarm, alerting everyone. That left the loading docks. That would be their way out. "Anna, we're going to the back loading area," he said, gripping her hand again. "We have to move fast and quiet. Can you do that?" She nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. Ethan moved swiftly, keeping low, navigating through the factory's industrial labyrinth. He stayed in the shadows, using the noise of the machines to mask their movement. The loading docks were at the far end of the factory, past the assembly line and the quality control area. It would take a few minutes to get there, minutes they might not have. Every few steps, Ethan glanced over his shoulder. The men were still moving, splitting up now, covering more ground. They were searching the factory with the patience of hunters. Then, just as Ethan turned a corner, he saw something that made his heart stop. Mr. Garrett. His boss was standing near the main control panel, speaking into a radio. His face was tight with tension, his fingers gripping the device like a lifeline. Ethan couldn't hear what he was saying, but the way he was scanning the factory made it clear. He was helping the men find Anna. Bile rose in Ethan's throat. His own boss was involved. That was why the intercom message had been so perfectly timed. Garrett wasn't just looking the other way. He was a part of whatever this was. Ethan ducked back behind a machine, gritting his teeth. This had just become even more dangerous. If Garrett was involved, there was no telling who else was. Security, workers, supervisors. Anyone could be a part of this. They were alone in this fight. He squeezed Anna's hand. Change of plan. We have to go faster. She looked up at him, fear in her eyes, but she nodded. They moved quickly, weaving through the factory. Ethan's pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. Every second counted. He had to get her out. The loading docks were just ahead now. He could see the large rolling doors, the stacked crates, the forklifts parked in the corner. Almost there. But then, a voice behind them. "Stop right there." Ethan spun around. One of the men in suits was standing less than 20 feet away. The man's expression was eerily calm, his eyes cold and detached. His hands were in his pockets, but Ethan wasn't fooled. He had the posture of someone ready to fight. "You're making a mistake," the man said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "That girl belongs to us." Ethan's jaw clenched. "She's not property." The man sighed, shaking his head. "You don't understand what's happening here. You don't know who you're dealing with. Walk away now, and this all goes away. No consequences, no problems." Ethan didn't move. The man's smile faded. "Last chance, Cole. Step aside." Ethan's blood went cold. "He knows my name." They had done their homework. This wasn't random. This was planned. He tightened his grip on Anna's hand. "You want her? You're gonna have to go through me." The man sighed again, as if disappointed. Then, with a small nod, he signaled to someone behind him. Footsteps. More men. Ethan's mind raced. He was outnumbered, unarmed, and protecting a child. He had seconds to make a decision. "Run. Hold on tight," he whispered to Anna. And then he ran. He bolted toward the loading docks, Anna's hand in his, sprinting as fast as he could. Behind them, the men shouted, their footsteps pounding against the concrete. Ethan reached the dock doors. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe and slammed it against the emergency release lever. The loading door roared open. Cold night air flooded in. Beyond the dock, the parking lot stretched out into the darkness. If they could just make it outside. Anna yelped. Ethan turned. One of the men had grabbed her sweater. Rage exploded inside him. Without thinking, Ethan swung the pipe with all his strength. It connected with the man's ribs. The sickening thud echoed through the factory. The man stumbled back, cursing, clutching his side. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed Anna and ran. They sprinted into the night, their breath sharp and ragged. Behind them, the men were shouting. But Ethan didn't stop. He ran toward the only place he knew might still be safe. His truck. The factory was behind them now. But the fight was far from over. Because Ethan had just stolen a piece of their cargo. And they weren't going to let that go unanswered. A dangerous pursuit. Ethan's legs burned as he ran. The weight of Anna's small hand in his own the only thing keeping him focused. The factory loomed behind them, the shouts of the men in suits still echoing in the night air. He could hear them, chasing, gaining ground. The cold wind stung his face, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Ahead, the parking lot stretched out, dimly lit by the overhead industrial lights. Rows of parked cars and trucks lined the pavement, providing temporary cover. His own truck, a battered but reliable Ford F-150, was parked on the far end, near the employee exit. If he could just reach it, they might have a chance. "Faster, Anna," he urged, glancing down at her. Her tiny feet pounded against the pavement, her oversized sweater flapping as she struggled to keep up. She was exhausted, barely holding on. Ethan cursed under his breath. She had been running long before he found her, and she was running on nothing but fear. They needed another plan. Ethan made a split-second decision and veered to the right, weaving between two parked semi-trucks. He crouched behind one, pulling Anna close to him, her small body trembling. His breath came fast and hard, his heart pounding against his ribs. He listened carefully. Footsteps. Close. Too close. The men weren't just chasing them blindly. They were tracking them. These weren't random criminals. These men knew what they were doing. Ethan's military instincts kicked in. His mind mapped the area in seconds. The angles, the shadows, the places where they could hide, the potential escape routes. He counted the footsteps. 2 men approaching from different angles. They were trying to trap them, funnel them toward the back wall where there would be no exit. Not happening. Ethan knelt in front of Anna, his hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me, kiddo," he whispered urgently. "We have to be quiet now. Do you understand?" Anna nodded quickly, pressing her lips together. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there. Trust. She was scared, but she was trusting him to get her out of this. Ethan gave her a small nod, then scanned their surroundings. He spotted an old utility van parked a few feet away. It was locked, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the space beneath it. "Under the van," he whispered, pointing. "Crawl under there and don't come out until I say." Anna hesitated only for a second before dropping to the ground and squeezing herself under the vehicle. Ethan made sure she was hidden, then turned back toward the approaching footsteps. A flicker of movement, one of the men rounding the corner. Ethan didn't give him a chance to react. He lunged forward, grabbing a metal wrench lying on the ground nearby. Before the man could fully process what was happening, Ethan swung, hard. The wrench connected with the side of the man's head. The man grunted in pain, stumbling back, dazed. Ethan didn't hesitate. He followed up with a brutal punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. The man collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and yanked him closer. "Who are you working for?" he demanded, his voice low and furious. The man glared at him, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You have no idea what you've done," he spat. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Who's in charge? The man smirked, even through the pain. You can't stop this. Ethan didn't have time to argue. He knocked the man out cold with another punch and turned back to Anna's hiding spot. Come on, he whispered. She scrambled out from under the van, and he scooped her up in his arms, cradling her against his chest. She gasped in surprise but didn't fight it. She was too tired. Ethan moved fast, his boots silent against the pavement. He stuck to the shadows, weaving between parked vehicles. The factory's perimeter fence was about 50 yards away. If he could reach it, he could find another way out, maybe even a side road where he could get help. But then, headlights. A black SUV screeched to a stop near the exit. The doors flew open, and 3 more men stepped out. Ethan's stomach dropped. These weren't just random goons. These men moved like military. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was bigger. Much bigger. One of the men, taller than the others, took a step forward. He was dressed in a black suit, but unlike the others, his presence commanded authority. Ethan Cole, the man said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Ethan tightened his grip on Anna. I don't know who the hell you are, but you're not getting this kid. The man sighed. You're a smart man, Cole. You know what happens to people who get in the way of things they don't understand. Ethan glared. I spent my whole life fighting people like you. The man smirked. Then you should know when you're outnumbered. Ethan didn't respond. Because he wasn't outnumbered. The sound of police sirens cut through the night. The men stiffened, their heads snapping toward the factory entrance. Red and blue lights flashed, reflecting off the metal of the parked cars. The unmistakable screech of tires filled the air. Ethan grinned. I called them before I ran, he said. Figured I'd need backup. The man's smirk faltered. You don't know what you've done, Cole. Yeah. Ethan said, taking a step forward. Why don't you tell the cops? Before the men could react, a squad of police officers stormed into the parking lot, guns drawn. Freeze! One of the officers shouted. Hands in the air. The men hesitated. Then they ran. The officers immediately gave chase, but Ethan didn't wait to see what happened. He turned and sprinted toward the police vehicles, Anna still in his arms. A female officer saw them and rushed forward. Sir, put the child down. Ethan stopped just short of her, breathless. She's the one they were after, he said. She needs protection. The officer's face softened as she looked at Anna, who was clinging to Ethan's shirt, shaking. It's okay, sweetie, the officer said gently. You're safe now. Ethan slowly lowered Anna to the ground. She hesitated, looking up at him. Is it really over? She whispered. Ethan knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Almost, he said. But I promise you, you'll never have to run again. The officer led Anna toward the safety of a police car, wrapping a blanket around her small shoulders. Ethan exhaled, his entire body finally relaxing. He turned back toward the factory. And that's when he saw Mr. Garrett. His boss was standing near the entrance, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic as the police began questioning him. Ethan walked toward him, stopping just inches away. Looks like your business just collapsed, he said, his voice cold. Garrett swallowed hard. You don't understand. Ethan cut him off. No, you don't understand. I was a Marine. I fought for this country. And I don't let men like you win. The officers moved in, placing Garrett in handcuffs. Ethan watched as the man who had been his boss, his superior, was led away. For the first time that night, he let himself breathe. Anna was safe. The traffickers were caught. And Ethan Cole. He was just getting started. The aftermath and the unfinished war. Ethan stood motionless as the flashing red and blue lights of the police vehicles painted his surroundings in streaks of color. His chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths, his body still humming with adrenaline. his fists clenched at his sides as he watched Mr. Garrett being shoved into the back of a squad car, his face drained of color, his eyes darting in silent panic. The once authoritative factory boss, the man who had ordered workers around with a mere flick of his hand, now sat powerless, his hands cuffed behind his back. The officers continued to sweep the parking lot, securing the last of the men in suits. Some had managed to slip away in the chaos, but a majority had been subdued and placed under arrest. A handful of detectives were already questioning the remaining employees still inside the factory, ensuring that no other conspirators were lurking among them. This was no longer just a local police matter. This was federal. Ethan turned away from the arrests and instead focused on what truly mattered. Anna, the little girl, sat wrapped in a thick police-issued blanket in the back seat of a squad car. A female officer, Sergeant Diaz, was crouched beside her, speaking softly, her tone gentle but firm. Anna's small fingers clutched at the edges of the blanket as if it were a shield, her eyes darting between the officer and Ethan. Ethan took a slow step toward the car, uncertain of whether Anna would still trust him now that they were surrounded by law enforcement. He had never been particularly good with kids. His years in the Marines had trained him for war, for discipline, for breaking enemies and following orders, not for handling frightened little girls who had been treated like cargo. But Anna wasn't just any child. She had chosen him. She had run to him. And for reasons he couldn't fully understand, that meant everything. Sergeant Diaz straightened as he approached, her sharp eyes studying him. "Cole, right?" she asked. Her tone was firm, professional, but not unkind. "Yeah," Ethan replied, stopping beside her. He nodded toward Anna. "How's she holding up?" Diaz sighed, running a hand through her tied-back hair. "She's shaken, but that's expected. She won't talk much, but that's normal for kids who've been through." She glanced at Anna, choosing her words carefully. "Situations like this." Ethan clenched his jaw. Situations like this. He knew exactly what she meant. Anna had been trafficked, branded, stolen from whatever life she might have had and forced into something no child should ever have to endure. The thought made his stomach twist in fury. "She trusts you," Diaz continued, her voice quieter. "She's barely said a word to any of us, but when we asked her if she was safe now, she just pointed at you." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening at those words. She had chosen him again. He didn't deserve that kind of trust. He wasn't anyone special. He wasn't some hero. He was just a factory worker trying to do the right thing. And yet, in her eyes, he was something more. He took a deep breath and crouched down to meet Anna's gaze. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. Anna's fingers clutched the edge of her blanket, but she didn't shrink away. She blinked up at him with tired, wary eyes, studying him like she was waiting for him to tell her what to do next. "It's over," Ethan reassured her. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Anna hesitated for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Really?" That one word nearly broke him. He had spent years fighting wars on foreign soil, had watched men and women live and die, had been trained to compartmentalize pain and focus only on survival. But this tiny voice, filled with hesitation and disbelief, cut deeper than anything he had ever faced. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Really?" Anna didn't say anything else, but she didn't need to. She just nodded slowly, like she wanted to believe him, but wasn't sure if she was allowed to. Ethan turned back to Sergeant Diaz. "What happens to her now?" Diaz exhaled. "She'll go into protective custody for now. The feds will be involved, and they'll try to find out where she came from, if she has any family left. It'll be a long process." Ethan's gut twisted at the thought of Anna being shuffled through the system, being treated like just another case file on someone's desk. He knew how slow these things could move, and worst of all, if the trafficking ring was as big as he suspected, there was no guarantee the system would keep her safe. Somewhere out there, someone still owned her, and they might come looking. "She doesn't belong in the system," Ethan said, his voice low. Diaz raised an eyebrow. And what are you suggesting, Cole? Ethan hesitated. He had no experience raising kids. He had no legal claim to Anna. Hell, he wasn't even sure why he felt this overwhelming need to protect her. All he knew was that if he let her disappear into the machine of foster care and bureaucracy, she might never truly be safe. I can look after her, he said before he even fully processed the thought. Diaz blinked. That's not how this works, Cole. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. I know. She needs someone who'll fight for her. Diaz studied him for a long moment. Then she glanced at Anna, who was still silently watching them. Finally, the officer sighed. Look, I'll put in a report and mention that she trusts you. That might give you a leg to stand on if you want to push for guardianship later. But for now, she's going into protective custody. That's non-negotiable. Ethan clenched his jaw, but nodded. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but at least it gave him a chance. As he stood up, Anna suddenly reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Ethan froze, looking down at her. Will you come back? She asked, her voice small but insistent. Ethan didn't hesitate. Yeah, kid, I'll come back. And in that moment, he knew it wasn't a promise he was making lightly. 1 week later, Ethan sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He was parked outside the Child Protective Services building, staring at the entrance like it was an enemy fortress. For the past week, he had been unable to shake Anna from his thoughts. He had stayed in contact with Sergeant Diaz, keeping tabs on the investigation on the arrests on Anna. The trafficking ring was bigger than anyone had anticipated, stretching across multiple states. More arrests had been made, but the higher-ups, the ones truly responsible, were still out there. And Anna was still alone. He had spent the last few days making calls, talking to lawyers, trying to figure out what he could do. He wasn't family. He wasn't a foster parent, but he was something to her, and that had to count for something. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the truck door and stepped out. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. He wasn't sure what his future looked like. All he knew was that he had made a promise, and Ethan Cole didn't break promises. A battle worth fighting. Ethan Cole had never felt nervous walking into a building before. Not when he had stepped into a recruitment office at 18, signing away his youth to the military. Not when he had been deployed to war zones where every step could trigger an IED. Not even when he had left that life behind, trading combat gear for steel-toed boots and factory shifts. But now, as he pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Child Protective Services building, he felt something deep in his gut that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Uncertainty. The office smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, its beige walls covered in posters about child safety and legal procedures. The air carried that peculiar weight found in places where bureaucracy ruled over human lives. A tired-looking receptionist barely glanced up from her computer screen as Ethan approached the desk. I'm here to see Sergeant Diaz, he said, his voice firm. The receptionist eyed him with mild disinterest, typing something into her system. And you are? Ethan Cole. She clicked a few more keys, then sighed, nodding toward a door marked Visitation Room 3. She's expecting you. Ethan exhaled sharply. Here we go. He strode toward the door, forcing himself to push aside the creeping doubts clawing at his thoughts. What am I even doing here? He wasn't a father. He wasn't trained for this. He had spent his life fighting wars, working machinery, keeping to himself. The idea of becoming a guardian to a child, a traumatized child, was insane. But then he thought of Anna. He thought of her hiding under that machine, her small hands clenched into fists, her terrified whisper, I don't want to go back to the men. He thought of the way she had clung to him when the police arrived, the way she had chosen him when she could have chosen anyone else. He thought of the barcode on her wrist, the evidence of what she had been forced to endure. And just like that, his doubts disappeared. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Inside, Sergeant Diaz stood near a window, her arms crossed. She was dressed in civilian clothes now, her badge clipped to her belt. Across the room, sitting on a chair much too big for her, was Anna. She was curled up in the seat, hugging the stuffed bear tightly to her chest. It was a cheap, well-worn thing, probably given to her by a social worker. But she clung to it like it was her last piece of safety. When the door closed behind Ethan, Anna's head snapped up. For a brief second, she just stared at him. Then she whispered, "You came back." Ethan's chest tightened. He crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "Told you I would." Anna hesitated, her grip on the bear tightening. But then she smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Ethan looked up at Diaz. "How's she doing?" Diaz sighed. "Better than expected, but she's still not talking much. She's been placed in temporary foster care for now. But," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "she's refusing to stay with any of the families." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Diaz glanced at Anna, then back at him. "Because she keeps asking for you." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "She's been through hell, Cole," Diaz continued. "She's scared, but more than that, she doesn't trust anyone. Except you." Ethan looked at Anna again. She was watching him with those same wary, intelligent eyes. He knew that look. It was the same look soldiers had in the field, the look of someone who had seen things they weren't supposed to see, who had endured things no one should have to endure. He exhaled slowly. "What do I have to do?" Diaz arched an eyebrow. "You serious about this?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Legally, this is going to be a process. You can't just take her home today. You'd have to apply for emergency guardianship first, and if that goes through, then we can start working toward long-term custody." Ethan nodded. "Fine. I'll do whatever it takes." Diaz crossed her arms. "This isn't just signing a paper, Cole. This is commitment. You don't get to back out halfway. This girl has already been abandoned and betrayed by enough people. If you do this, you do it all the way." Ethan's jaw clenched. He turned back to Anna, seeing the way she was trying to make herself smaller, the way she was gripping that bear like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I don't walk away from the people I care about," he said simply. Diaz studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right. I'll start making the calls." As she stepped out to begin the legal process, Ethan sat down across from Anna. "Looks like you're stuck with me, kid," he said, offering a small smirk. Anna stared at him, her fingers fidgeting with the fur of the stuffed bear. "You don't have to." Ethan tilted his head. "Have to what?" "Stay," she whispered. "People don't stay." Ethan swallowed hard. How many times had she been promised safety, only to have it ripped away? How many times had she been told she was worth something, only to be treated like property? He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm not people, Anna. I'm me. And I don't break promises." She didn't say anything. But after a long moment, she slowly uncurled from her defensive position and slid her small hand across the table, resting it on top of his. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a realization, a decision. This wasn't just about rescuing a kid from danger anymore. This was about giving her a future, a life that was hers, a life where she was free. And Ethan Cole, he would fight for that life, no matter what it took, no matter who tried to take it from her, because Anna wasn't cargo. She was his family now, and no one was going to take her away again.